The king firmly denied any knowledge of it. He didn't really know. Maybe, I don't want to get into his mind, but it sounded to me like maybe these could have been rogue killers. Who knows? We're going to try getting to the bottom of it very soon, but his was a flat denial.
We've entered the second week of Jamal Khashoggi's disappearance, and the mystery surrounding what happened to him has only deepened. The Saudi journalist was last seen October 2nd entering the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. He hasn't been seen since. Today, U.S. President Donald Trump, as you just heard, suggested that rogue killers could be responsible after speaking to Saudi Arabia's king by phone. Trump has also sent his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, to Riyadh to meet with the king. Meanwhile, Turkish officials continue to insist they have video and audio evidence Khashoggi was murdered in their consulate on orders from the Saudi regime. Today, Canada joined its allies and called for an open investigation.
Canada remains very troubled by the disappearance of prominent Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Canada calls for a thorough, credible, and transparent investigation into the serious allegations about Mr. Khashoggi's disappearance. We look forward to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia providing complete and detailed information. Those bearing responsibility for the disappearance of Mr. Khashoggi must be held to account.
Earlier today, I spoke with Canada's former and most recent ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Dennis Horak. He was expelled from the country in August. Of course, I want to ask you about the larger issues between the two countries as far as our relationship goes, but I have to start with what has been consuming a lot of dialogue over the past few weeks, and that is the disappearance and alleged killing of Jamal Khashoggi. What has been going through your mind as you watch this play out?
It's outrageous, obviously. It's tragic for people close to him, and it's not the kind of behavior that any state should be doing in this day and age.
Do you think the state of Saudi Arabia is responsible?
We don't know all the evidence, obviously, but clearly what we do know points to that. It's hard to imagine how these circumstances evolved any other way.
Based on your experience in the country, is this as unfathomable as it might seem with any other?
Over the past couple of years, I stopped saying I can't be surprised anymore, because a lot of things that were happening there were surprising, both for good and more recently for bad. I think it's representative of the tightening political space that we've seen in Saudi Arabia, especially the last year, with the arrests of the women's rights activists, for example, which just caught everyone by surprise, given the very positive developments that had been happening up until then in terms of women driving and other sorts of reforms that were being put in. And then they turn around and arrest a number of these women for allegedly security reasons, but probably more so for some of the political activities that they had earlier on. But which they had gone quiet on for a while, and this is again, if in fact these allegations are true, it's emblematic of a tightening of the political space and intolerance for political dissent, whether at home or abroad.
Based on your experience there, what do you think is behind the tightening of the political space?
The reform program they have in Saudi Arabia, this Vision 2030, it's good. It talks about diversification of the economy. It talks about social reforms, and a lot of those social reforms have been put in place. We've seen the whole entertainment sphere opened up. But what it's not about democratization. In fact, we've seen, as I said, we've seen a tightening of the controls on dissent, and it's. We will tell you what the reforms will be. We will. This is the leadership. We will tell the people, our subjects, where they can go, what they can do, what will open up for them. But in terms of political dialogue, they don't want that. They don't want to sort of have this nascent political dialogue that's going to start demanding perhaps other reforms and other changes. And I think it's a growing authoritarianism in a way, which is different from what it used to be. It might surprise some people, but it didn't feel as authoritarian before. People would talk openly and freely about various things. And really the last few months I was there, you started to get Saudis more and more being a little bit more cautious about what they would say to foreigners and to others. So it was a bit of a chill that was put on things then. And obviously if this is what happened, the message may be, we can get you wherever, be quiet. And it's surprising because they've had critics overseas for decades and haven't really taken these kinds of steps before. So.
Did that tightening that you described impact your ability to do your job, or impact the environment in which you did your job?
A little bit. In talking to Saudis, I mean, we got to know, we had good relationships, personal relationships with a number of Saudis, and they would be open and free with us. But I would talk to them and say, hey, what's your feeling about this? And some of the people that were arrested, I knew them. The embassy, my staff knew them quite well, some of them. And so it did create a little bit of concern about people were just a little bit more cautious about what they would say to us, say to foreigners.
Were you able to, do you think, advance the cases or the causes of those activists, for example, or people who were speaking out and who did face reprimand?
Not really. I had some discussions with some Saudi members of Saudi leadership and members of Saudi government on that. We would get the normal, this is our internal affairs, mind your own business sort of a response, which was typical for Saudi Arabia and other countries I've been in. Iran was very much the same way when I was there. They know we're aware of it. They know we were concerned about it. We weren't the only ones. Other countries were doing the same sort of things. I don't know that it helps. I think the sort of kind of dialogue that happens at more senior levels when you have a fully engaged relationship, I think, probably has a little bit better impact than sort of issuing tweets or issuing statements and that sort of thing. And the kind of dialogue that we would have, leader to leader, king to prime minister, in a relationship that's fuller than the one we had, I think is more helpful. The Americans or the Brits as well, because they have a much, much deeper relationship. Those sorts of discussions, insofar as they address those issues, I think probably have more of an impact. But they don't like to be told what to do.
Do you think the Canadian government should have pursued a more fulsome relationship?
I do.
You do?
Mm-hmm.
Did you tell them that?
I'm not really going to go into what I told them when I was working for them, but I think you can draw the conclusion that I had some concerns about that we weren't investing enough in the relationship.
What was the pushback? What is the hesitancy? I mean, it could be obvious insofar as there is great concern over the human rights record in that country, but that concern has been there for a number of years. So what was the pushback?
There wasn't really much of a pushback. There wasn't really a lot of discussion on it. There just didn't seem to be a whole lot of interest in it, and that's fine. It's up to the government to decide which relationships are priority, which ones are not, how to pursue them. It was my role as a diplomat, my role when I was in Ottawa to make policy recommendations, and it's up to the government to decide. They wouldn't necessarily explain to me why they didn't want to take the recommendations or pursue a certain policy. And admittedly, Minister Freeland was very much preoccupied, and rightly so, with NAFTA. But I don't think it's a relationship that we cultivated. And it may, I'm speculating here, but it may have to do with the difficult politics of it. As you said, the human rights issue. The LAV deal obviously creates a lot of furor and a lot of circles in Canada, and perhaps the politics of it weren't worth it. But again, that's speculation. I don't know that.
Do you understand, I guess, the concern that a lot of, for example, people who are concerned about human rights would have with pursuing a greater relationship? And what is the counterpoint to that, if there is one?
I do, but I think it's short-sighted. I mean, we can make gestures, if we were to sort of not have break relations with Saudi Arabia, or just continually tweet as we did, or issue statements as we have, and not have a fuller relationship. That's fine. It's a gesture. It maybe makes us feel better that we've stood up for human rights, and that's fine. But I don't think what it gives us is the kind of access to leadership that we need to perhaps have influence. If we're just standing on the sidelines, as I've said before, if we're standing on the sidelines and yelling, that's fine. It makes us feel good, but it's easy for the leadership there, and they're the ones who make these decisions, to ignore us. But if we have a fully engaged relationship, if ministers know each other, if the Prime Minister has visited and knows them, or if the Crown Prince had visited Canada and a relationship was built, it gives you the kind of access to people that can actually change things. Whether we would be successful in influencing them or not is an open question, certainly. But without that sort of access, you have no influence. You can't have influence.
Is it difficult, though, to forge a relationship with somebody like, the King or the Crown Prince, who we're now talking about in the context of allegedly directing the killing of a journalist? Well,
we don't know how high it would have gone. Obviously, most of the decisions taken these days seem to be funneled through the royal court. But you do have to talk to uncomfortable people in diplomacy. That's the nature of the business. We don't just talk to people we like. Those conversations can happen very easily. The tougher ones, and the ones where we have challenges and we have problems, where issues we want to resolve, those are often with people that we have some very fundamental differences with, but that doesn't mean they're not important to have those conversations.
Were you frustrated by the lack of those conversations? Was it frustrating in your job?
A little bit, it was. When I would see all of my colleagues, G7 colleagues, G20 colleagues, and they would get a succession of ministers through, and they would have meetings at the most senior level, and really try and establish relationships, and we weren't doing it. In the 3 years I was there, we had 2 ministers visit, neither of which were in a bilateral context, and that was it.
Could you get meetings with anyone in sort of the top levels of that administration?
I met some ministers, but in terms of the royal court, no.
And what do you think that means for cases like Raif Badawi?
We're doing it with one hand tied behind our backs, because we don't have a relationship. If the only reason there is any sort of contact with the foreign minister, for example, and I know that Minister Freeland has spoken to him today on this issue, on the Khashoggi issue. But if we're only contacting them when we have a problem or when we have an issue to address, I don't think that's an effective way to sort of advance our agenda. If you have a relationship, and it's I think what made us vulnerable to this whole tweet row that happened this summer, because they had nothing to lose with this. So it's a challenge in that respect, and I think that again, for cases that we won't advance, we end up doing it with one hand tied behind our backs.
You can catch the second part of my interview with Canada's former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Dennis Horak, coming up in the next hour. Is there a path back to any semblance of a relationship from where you sit, short of making an apology, because the Canadian government has said we're not going to do that?
Well, I don't think an apology is warranted in this case. This was clearly a major overreaction on the Saudi part. Okay, I understand that they're ticked off about the tweet, fine. The normal course of events is I was in Canada, but I was going to be back in 2 days after this happened. Normal course of events would be to call me in, to complain, to protest the language perhaps that we use, that sort of thing. As I said, when I was in Iran, I was called in about every 2 or 3 weeks because of the something that the Conservative government, that Prime Minister Harper, Minister Baird had said literally every 2 or 3 weeks, here a complaint, and that would be the normal course of events. To react the way they did to a tweet is I mean, it's crazy. But so I don't think we owe an apology, because it wasn't that drastic of a thing to say. I think there needs to be dialogue, extended dialogue with the Saudis on how to come back from this. And there may be some formulas to work out on how we do that and what we say and what we do. The Germans and the Swedes both had troubles with the Saudis in the past and worked out ways.
They kind of had to apologize, though.
It depends on what you mean by apology. I mean, the Germans, if I remember, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, talked about that there was a misinterpretation of what they had said. And I think we could fairly say that the Saudis had the overreaction was partly based on their misinterpretation of what we were trying to do. We weren't trying to interfere in their internal affairs. It's not what we were doing. Just because it was in Arabic, we translated every tweet into Arabic. We weren't particularly targeting their countries as.
But you seemed to indicate in your comments just a few minutes ago, like you seemed kind of annoyed by the tweet too, like.
Yeah, I was on holiday at the time. I wasn't a fan of it, but it wasn't my position, my role at the embassy, to edit down things that came from headquarters or came from the minister. We would translate them and put them up as is. Those sorts of discussions happen in headquarters, I know from when I was there. If there were concerns about the language, and those things are worked out, and there's a whole process for developing those. And once it comes out of headquarters, it's our role as an embassy to put it up and to sort of to amplify that, and that's what we did. If I was in headquarters, would I have drafted it that way or put it up that way? Probably not. But I don't think it was that far off on previous things that we had said about the arrest of these women and in other situations. As
we talk about returning to some sort of relationship, now it's against the backdrop of everything that's happening with Mr. Khashoggi. In your view, if there is some sort of conclusion drawn after facts are presented in some capacity that this is the Saudi government was culpable here, is that some sort of tipping point? Is it a point of no return?
I don't think so. I don't think it should either. Minister Freeland talked with Minister Al-Jubeir today, as I understand it, and I think that's exactly the right approach. I heard a lot of talk this weekend that this is the time to pull the plug on the LAV deal, for example. I'm not sure where that gets us. Okay, we lose a few thousand Canadian jobs. We undercut our reputation as a reliable supplier. But what does that do in terms of shaping or curbing Saudi policy, nothing. And all of the countries are dealing with the same dilemma. You know, all this talk about sanctions. You're not going to be able to isolate Saudi Arabia. They're just too important a country, and the reason they're too important a country in the world oil markets, we can't isolate them in the way that people think that perhaps we can. Nor should we. I don't think that we want a Saudi Arabia.
Even if they're guilty of murdering somebody?
But I don't think we want a Saudi Arabia that, assuming again that we could somehow isolate them and really put pressure on, do we want to risk destabilizing a country that, if it becomes destabilized, will the impact of that will reverberate across the world?
Will it be much worse, though, than the way in which they act right now, that tightening of the political space that you talked about?
You look at,
it could get a lot worse.
It could get a whole. There's not a lot of Democrats waiting in the wings to come take over. If this place gets destabilized, you know, you look at Syria, you look at Libya. If things were to become very, very difficult in Saudi Arabia, and it would become destabilized, you know, there's a major prize sitting in Saudi Arabia. It's Mecca. If instability hits Saudi Arabia, it's going to hit everywhere, and you know, the instability in the Gulf is bad for the world. The other issue is about sanctions. Is in this kind of a circumstance, is what's the end game? I mean, normally sanctions, you put sanctions in place, and it's designed to get a country to do X. Mm-hmm. In this circumstance, what's X? What is it that sanctions would lead us to? What's the threshold?
Stop murdering journalists? Stop, or you know what I mean?
Okay, but at one point, do you say, okay, they've stopped murdering journalists, we're going to lift sanctions, or these become permanent? You know what I'm saying? Is that there's usually a defined objective.
Or they stop jailing, you know, people who speak out, or the Raif Badawi's, his sister, that kind. I mean, there are actually. I take your point, but I think there are a lot of people who watch what happened in that country and say, what do we stand for as a country? Is that worth articulating? I think what you're saying is, to what end?
To what end? And this is where I think the most effective approach, as Minister Freeland did today, it seems, and as other countries, as President Trump has done, and I'm sure a lot of other countries have done, is to you know, get on the phone and talk to them and say, you know what, this is really not the way to become, as the Crown Prince said he wanted it, to become a normal and modern country. You know, this is not the way to attract investors.
If we're to believe that's what he really wants.
I think he does, but his definition of what normal and modern is perhaps a little bit different than ours. But it's also they're looking to attract investment, and you know, the kind of messaging that goes, hey, you know what, this is really not the way to do that. You need to you know, pull up your socks here and come back and come into the modern world. Those kinds of conversations, I think, will have much greater influence than trying to isolate this place, because, as I said, I don't think it's possible to. I don't think it's possible to put that kind of economic pressure on that, say, you have with Iran or Venezuela. It's a very different place, and economically, given their role in the oil market, for example, you cannot isolate them.
Okay, I have to leave it there, but thank you, Mr. Horak. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.